Good evening and welcome to episode 77 of Mystery, Murder, and Mayhem. In the past, I've talked about how mental illness has played a major role in the crimes that many murderers have committed. Tonight, I'm bringing you the story of a mass murder where the perpetrators of mental illness took the crime and committed to new heights.
It's Monday, and that means it's time for a new episode of Mystery, Murder, and Magic. And here's your host, Andrea Lee, and sometimes Alex.
Back in March of this year, the world learned that a commercial airline flight had crashed in China, killing 132 people on board. Then in May, the flight recorder findings were released, and what it showed was quite shocking. It's believed that the entire crash was due to a murder-suicide. Now, not a lot of details have been released detailing the circumstances, but this is not the first time in history that this has happened. Now, my mom, she loves to watch television shows about airline disasters. And she especially loves to watch those, usually when I'm getting ready to fly somewhere. But, she calls me crazy for being so into true crime and serial killers, but she's the one who will binge watch episode after episode of airline crashes. Well, anyway, one day I decided to watch a couple of episodes with her, and there was one in particular that I've thought about a lot since I watched it. In that episode, it told the story of the crash of Germanwings Flight 9525 in the French Alps in 2015. That's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. So that flight, it was scheduled to be an international flight. It was going to take off in Barcelona, and it was due to land in Düsseldorf, Germany. But that flight never made it to Germany. The Airbus A320 had departed Spain just before 10 a.m. that morning on a flight, and it was only going to last about 2 hours, so it was a relatively short flight. And when the plane had reached a cruising altitude of 38,000 feet, the pilot, his name was Captain Patrick Sondenheimer, he told his co-pilot Andreas Lubitz that he had forgotten to use the restroom before boarding the plane. So Lubitz was like, go ahead, I've got this. Well, Sondenheimer pushed his seat back, left the cockpit, closed the door behind him, and went into the restroom. And that was around 10:30 that morning. Well, what happened next changed everyone on board's lives forever. Once Sondenheimer was out of the cockpit, Lubitz locked the door to the cockpit, and in doing so, he disabled Sondenheimer's emergency access code. Then he readjusted the autopilot to bring the plane's altitude down to just 100 feet. Within moments, the airplane was losing altitude at a rate of 3,500 feet per minute, which equals to roughly 60 feet per second. Now imagine the terror of everybody on board. Well, French controllers noticed the change with the altitude, and nobody had authorized that drop in altitude. So they started reaching out to the airplane, but Lubitz ignored the efforts. Sondenheimer he had only been gone for about 3 minutes from the cockpit. When he returned, his access code was denied. So he started pounding on the door, demanding that Lubitz let him in. But he ignored Sondenheimer also. As you can imagine, this wave of events was causing the passengers to panic. Can you imagine being on a flight, which, already makes a lot of people nervous, but you're on a flight and the pilot is pounding on the door, wanting to be let back in the cockpit? You have to wonder what is going on out there. Well, Seidenheimer tried opening the door to the cockpit with a crowbar by prying it open, and then he resorted to striking the door with that crowbar, but the door wouldn't budge. While he's outside the door, pleading with Lubitz to let him in, Lubitz placed his oxygen mask over his face to help keep him calm. Well, outside of the airplane, the Alps were becoming closer and closer. And inside the plane, alarms were starting to sound, and when the plane was closely and quickly approaching the ground, a piercing ping just echoed throughout the airplane. A minute after that, an alarm went off, and the plane's right wing that is, grazed the mountainside, and it was only mere minutes later that the plane fully crashed into the mountain at 403 miles per hour. And those poor people didn't know what had hit them. I'm sure at that point, with all the panic going on inside the airplane, they knew something was up, but can you imagine smacking into the side of that mountain at 403 miles per hour? Now, soon the first reports of the airline tragedy were trickling out all over Europe. And among those who had perished on board on that airplane that day were 16 teenage students and 2 teachers who had been on a week-long exchange program in Spain. And those students' names had been pulled out of a hat to attend that program. So basically, I believe they could only take so many, so they chose from the 3 Spanish classes at the high school that they came from. They chose their names out of a hat to go. Well, soon after the crash, after they lost contact with that plane, a mountain rescue group was dispatched. They had received a call from an air traffic controller in Lyon, and the caller was reporting that a plane had disappeared from radar over the mountain peaks, and that was northwest of Nice. One of the explorers was lowered down to the region from a helicopter, and across the slope he could see smoke rising from the wreckage, and debris was scattered everywhere. And as he moved across the area, he made mental notes of what he was seeing, which included human torsos, shoes, seats from the airplane, and hands and feet that had become separated from the crash victims. And as he surveyed the wreckage of that plane, and that wreckage was literally tiny bits and pieces, it was clear to him that nobody could have possibly survived that crash. He continued to search the area and soon came across the airplane's registration plate and noted that it was German. Before he even descended into the area, he had been told not to touch anything, just go look, don't touch, and just kind of make notes of what you see. Well, soon his discoveries became even more horrifying. Faces that had been peeled away from the heads that they once belonged to were scattered across the ground with the debris. And they had been peeled off like how you peel a beauty treatment mask thing off, how it was described in everything that I've read. And then the explorer was shocked to find a small orange box about the size of a shoebox. Well, that orange shoebox was the cockpit's voice recorder. Now, in a lot of crashes, you hear that it takes days and sometimes even weeks to locate that recorder, but not this time. It was laying in plain sight and found less than an hour after the crash. After surveying the area, that explorer radioed back to his teammates of his findings, and soon a forensic team came out to collect the evidence. And that voice recorder was flown to Paris, and over the next few days, evidence was collected from those recordings. Now, I'm going to play for you now the audio from the voice recorder. It's the last few minutes of that flight. The quality isn't great, and I cleaned it up the best I could, to get the static out. And you can hear the captain pounding on the door, and then you'll notice that you can hear the right wing making contact with the mountain. And you can also hear when the captain is shouting, but it's hard to really make out what he's saying. But let's listen. Now, since that audio isn't clear, I'll explain what was found from that recording. After Sondenheimer told Lubitz that he needed to use the restroom, you can hear Lubitz respond with, "Go anytime." Then a few minutes later, you can hear Sondenheimer tell Lubitz to start preparing for landing, which included a checklist of items like checking the fuel levels, making sure that the landing gear is functioning properly, and that type of thing. So Sondenheimer excuses himself to the restroom, and when he returns around 3 minutes later, you can hear him pounding on the door when he discovers that he can't re-enter the cockpit. Then you can hear him yell, "For the love of God, open the door." Can you imagine? Like I said earlier, can you imagine what those passengers were thinking at that point? And I'm sure it was a panic that you couldn't even fathom until you're really in that situation. And Stevie's saying hello back there. She's very vocal this morning. But anyway, after trying to pry and beat the door open with that crowbar, Sondenheimer is then heard yelling, "Open the fucking door." And then an alarm sounded that meant ground was close by and to pull up. And I'm assuming that the moment the audio goes silent is when the airplane slammed into the mountain, killing everybody on board. Now, Germanwings is the airline that this flight belonged to, and it's a low-cost subsidiary of Lufthansa. I think I said that right, which is the largest airline in Europe. Back during World War II, it served as the airline for the Third Reich, and then the business collapsed like many did after the war. But that airline was revived in 1953 as the German National Airline, and at the time of the crash in the Alps, on 615 commercial airplanes. Well, it flew to 261 destinations in 101 countries on 6 continents. So, I mean, it was a pretty big deal airline. But after this disaster, the company's reputation was smudged. So, even though the company was outstanding and so well known, one would just have to wonder what went wrong that March day in 2015. But before, the flight recording had revealed what had happened that day, Sure, many thought that maybe it was pilot error or a malfunction with the plane. But as we would later find out, the captain was locked out of the cockpit at the time, and co-pilot Andreas Lubitz was left to keep watch over the flight. Let's talk about Lubitz and who he was. Now, as long as his family could remember, Lubitz had always wanted to fly, and he grew up in the town of Montabaur, which is about halfway between Frankfurt and Dusseldorf. And he was the firstborn son of a banker and a piano teacher. And he had been a quiet, well-mannered child. From an early age, Andy, as he was affectionately called by his family, wanted to be a pilot. Over his young formative youth, he became an accomplished glider pilot. And after he graduated from high school in 2007, he applied to join Lufthansa's Flight Academy. The following year, he was accepted into the program. For the first year of that Flight Academy, students study flight theory, and then the following year, they're taken to a flight training school in Arizona here in the United States. Was enthusiastic as he had been about becoming a pilot, though, only 2 months into the program, he dropped out and came back home. And soon he was diagnosed as having severe depressive episodes because he was having thoughts of killing himself. And he began this rigorous psychotherapy. And he was prescribed 2 very potent antidepressants. The psychiatrist that was treating him chalked it up to his modified living arrangements because once he moved to attend the Flight Academy and was separated from his parents and younger brother, that's when depression set in. So for the next 9 months, Lubitz was treated by the psychiatrist, and by the following July, the psychiatrist, he declared that Lubitz had made remarkable progress and said that he was in what he termed as remission. At that point, the doctor wrote a letter to German aviation officials, and he recommended that Lubitz be allowed to continue his flight training. While the doctor had pretty much deemed him as cured, he continued treating Lubitz, and he prescribed even more powerful antidepressants than he had previously been given. And after a couple of months, Lubitz's student license was restored, but a note was made on his fit to fly medical record saying that he would need regular examinations. And if there were any future treatments for depression, like any antidepressants prescribed or anything of the like, Lubitz would immediately be suspended from flying. And he finally finished his theory classes, and when he was about to go to the actual flight school in Arizona, he was required by U.S. officials to fill out a form. And one of the questions on that form asked if he had ever been diagnosed with any type of mental disorder, which included depression, and Lubitz checked off the box that read no. So he lied. But that lie was discovered. A German doctor who handles the paperwork that is sent to the U.S. saw that Lubitz had checked no when he was going over the document and reported this to the authorities. Well, normally, this would get a would-be pilot into a lot of trouble. But this time, for whatever reason, it only caused a delay. Lubitz was asked to provide a current detailed report from his psychiatrist. And long story short, he complied, and within a few weeks' time, he was on his way to Arizona. Well, while he was at the flight training school in the United States, he accumulated 100 hours of flight time. And some of it he had earned in an actual airplane, but the rest of it was earned on a flight simulator. And in the spring of 2011, he returned to Germany to continue his training, and to support himself, he worked as a flight attendant. Well, after that, there was no documented mental episodes, and soon he was working for Germanwings, where he quickly was promoted to first officer And then he was co-piloting like short flights in Germany and the western parts of Europe. And it seemed that he was really cut out for the job he had dreamed of having since he was a little kid. Things were definitely looking up for Lubitz, and in 2013, he and his girlfriend moved into this high-end apartment in Dusseldorf. And that girlfriend, her name was Catherine Goldbach. She said that their relationship was a very happy one. They had plans to get married and have 2 kids. But that would never happen. And as depression has a way of doing, it crept back into Lubitz's life just before Christmas of 2014. The symptoms he had at first weren't the usual ones of depression. Lubitz was certain that he was going blind. He visited doctor after doctor, sometimes as many as 4 in 1 week, saying that he was seeing stars or other things that were obscuring his vision. But none of the doctors he went to could find anything wrong with his vision. He would reject their diagnosis or lack of diagnosis. And one of those doctors even said that the cause was more than likely psychological. And with that, Lubitz stopped going to doctors altogether. And it was at this point his family doctor diagnosed him with an emergent psychosis and begged him to check into a mental health facility. But Lubitz wasn't having it. Over the following month, though, he began to believe that just maybe he did have some sort of psychological disorder that made him believe something was going wrong with his vision. So in January, his mom contacted that psychiatrist that had treated him after he left flight school after only 2 months, the one we talked about earlier. So this psychiatrist knew that Lubitz's depression had returned, and soon Lubitz was back to intensive psychotherapy and taking antidepressants. Well, the doctor asked Lubitz to start keeping what translates from German to English as a happiness diary. And a lot of his entries referenced insomnia that he was experiencing, but he was slowly starting to make a positive turn. Well, in Germany, privacy laws are strict, like they are here, like, you know, how we have the HIPAA Act. But, psychiatrists, they are allowed to report to anyone, including a patient's employer, if the patient seems to be a threat to themselves or others. But get this, psychiatrists chose not to report it. Now, even though it was earlier thought that he was once again going into remission from depression, soon it was discovered that Lubitz was thinking about death, and he was thinking about it often. And it was also found that he had searched the internet for effective ways to kill himself. And with that discovery, the psychiatrist wrote him out of work for a mere 4 days from work. 4 days. And get this, on that note, that psychiatrist wrote to excuse Lubitz from work. He said that Lubitz was experiencing vision issues. And yeah, we know he had complained about that. Okay, we do know. But shouldn't he have been just straight up with the airline and said that Lubitz was having suicidal thoughts? On the second day of that break from work, Lubitz researched on the web for information on the locking mechanism of the cockpit door for the type of airplane he would be co-piloting when he returned to work. Then on the night before returning to work, he jotted down the words Decision Sunday and the flight code letters for Barcelona. That note was later found in the garbage in his apartment. On the 23rd of March, Lubitz flew round trip between Dusseldorf and Berlin, and the pilot that was with him on that flight said his behavior was completely normal. Then that night, he and Catherine, his girlfriend, went grocery shopping, and she said that he acted completely normal then. And this is a woman who lived with him and was fully aware that he had been in a mental crisis. Well, the next morning, Lubitz drove to the airport, parked his car, and was seen in the cockpit for the last time, and soon he, along with 149 others, would cease to exist. Now, add an insult to injured feelings from the victims' families. Lufthansa never really showed any sympathy towards anyone but their employees who were killed that day. Now, they were awarded a little bit of money and their funerals were paid for, but it was just like Lufthansa had swept the whole thing under the rug. And this just outraged the family. So, I mean, of course it would. I mean, it seems like a company would go out of their way to compensate in any way they could families that had lost their loved ones that day. But they didn't, and it really made the families upset. So they got together and they hired a lawyer to sue them, but nothing really came out of that either. And there's also the fact that Germany has these laws that limit how much airlines pay out in these circumstances. So the airline was protected. And then there was more outrage to come from this whole thing, because on the second anniversary of the airline crash, Lubitz's father, Gunther, he held a news conference, and in that news conference, he basically said that his son was not responsible, and his son was not depressed at that time. And his exact words were, "Up to now, everyone has believed the theory of a co-pilot who was depressed for a long time, who deliberately crashed his plane into a mountain in a planned act. We are convinced this is false." Now, I should note here too, y'all, that many believe that Andreas Lubitz was narcissistic. And if that's true, it's clear to see that the apple doesn't really fall far from the tree, does it? Well, one time that elder Lubitz, the dad, he claimed that a carbon monoxide leak in the cabin caused his son to become dazed while Captain Sondenheimer was locked out of the cockpit. Listen, y'all, I have kids. I know it would be hard to accept that one of your kids could be responsible for such a horrible tragedy. And to say that he wasn't depressed at the time is just a bald-faced lie. There's documented proof. Andreas Lubitz, whether he was mentally unstable at the time or not, was responsible for that horrific crash. And I also feel that Lubitz, the psychiatrist, is somewhat responsible as well. He should have reported everything that he knew about Lubitz's mental status at that time, because Lubitz's career and his mental well-being affected others. And all he did was say that his vision was the issue. But y'all, let's just say that the vision was truly the issue, and this was just a thing, or just, like I'm saying, this is just a what if type of thing. But what if his vision was like genuinely the reason he had been written off of work for those 4 days? Why would an airline trust that after just 4 days, a co-pilot's vision was well enough to let him go co-pilot a plane again? Y'all, there's just so much wrong here, and it could have been prevented. Lubitz clearly fell through the cracks of the system. Worldwide, mental health is not getting the attention it deserves. Mental health patients are being overlooked and undertreated. You can't just throw pills at someone and expect it to fix what's wrong. I'm not a mental health professional, but it's obvious that there needs to be major reform in the mental health care community. Well, y'all, that's all I have for tonight's episode. Y'all have a good week, and be sure to check back in with me on Friday night for What the Friday.